I'm getting better at hitting the right part of this bell. It's dead in spots and live in others. If we could, we're going to call this to order because we have got a lot of ground to cover today. We're going to invite Luther Moore to come up and give us our invocation.
Please join me in prayer. Lord, you have given most of mankind a strong desire to do good, to be honest, to serve others, and to faithfully fulfill their obligations to their neighbors. Help us as Rotarians to do good. Help us as Rotarians to be honest and ethical in our dealings. Help us as Rotarians to serve others. And help us as Rotarians to faithfully fulfill our obligations as neighbors to our community, our nation, and the world. Amen.
Thank you, Luther. And Roger Serrell coming up to introduce our visitors and guests, I hope. Roger, are you in the house? If not, we'll take whatever substitutes you got.
It's my honor to introduce our visitors today. When I call your name, if you'd kindly stand and remain standing until all the names have been called, then we can give you a proper Rotary welcome. Kate Cotter is here, a guest of Jerry Cotter. It's Jerry's daughter. Where are you, Kate? Welcome. There she is. John Strickland, our friend who visited with us in Peru in 2014, is a guest of Herb Harris today. There he is, John. Daniel Peterson, guest of Mac McCarley. Welcome, Daniel. Robert Scotch, guest of Ed Kaiser. There he is. And Jennifer Woods, who's going to be a new member of ours, is a guest of Travis Vance. Let's welcome all of our guests. Thank you.
And stay standing, and if everybody else will stand, we're going to do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance. A succinct, tightly choreographed 3-minute presentation on history from Chase Saunders. Chase, did you hear about that succinct and carefully choreographed?
I'm already editing. Health is good. History, 20 years ago, now and then, intersection of Kings Drive and 4th Street. Captain Jack is on that corner now. Norris Automobiles, some of these other places, they are 20 years ago. YMCA now looks like it does on the left. Used to look like it does on the right. Intersection where the townhouse is 20 years ago, intersection today, now and then. That's right. 5 or 6 generations of Rotary presidents moved the corner on the right where nothing was on it to where the Rotary clock is today. So that's now and then 20 years. The next thing we're going to look at, the happiness part, is today in our democracy is Election Day 2018. We have a reason to celebrate. There are four reasons, 3 solid ones, and then we have what I call a Mac McCarley corollary. First reason to celebrate. This is the day when incumbents ask for more time to solve the problems they've not yet solved, while challengers offer assurances that they actually have the solutions to the problems as yet unsolved by the incumbents. The second reason to celebrate is that without elections, there would be no scandals. Now, if you think about the scandals that today, they're nothing compared to the past. Our founders were a tough bunch. President Adams didn't like President Jefferson, so he appointed John Marshall as the first Chief Justice. Vice President Burr, you'll remember, killed the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, because Hamilton called him, grounds for a duel, a dangerous man, thereby confirming that the remark was true. President Jefferson charged Burr and tried Burr 3 times for treason, and the reason for treason was that Burr decided that he wanted to take over all the land later known as the Louisiana Purchase and become the king, president, or otherwise. And Jefferson tried him 3 times, and he was acquitted by Chief Justice John Marshall 3 times. No judicial bias there. And Marshall went on to create the concept well known to lawyers of judicial review, where he could override the activities of the Supreme Court, of the legislature, Congress, or otherwise, because he was really skeptical about executive authority.
Chase, you're scaring me with the 3rd page of single-space stuff. I'm seeing it from here.
This is it.
Okay.
This is it. I will leave off the Watergate aspects. The floor fights, our South Carolina brethren were engaged in floor fights. Vinegar Ben Tillman, beat up his buddy, Senator McLaurin. They got kicked out. Senator Brooks and Senator Sumner, another caning. Best knife scandal comes from North Carolina, We had a North Carolina congressman who left Congress because he did some really terrible things with a knife to a couple of senators, allegedly involved with his spouse. And then he went to North Carolina, got in the legislature, kicked out of the North Carolina legislature because he took not only that knife, but a gun to the legislative poker fights. Finally, I'll get to the best quote. There's some other stuff in here we can talk about later. Wikipedia's got all of this. Best quote goes to Congressman Mike Myers, who during his trial for taking bribes was attributed to the quote uttered as he accepted $50,000 in hard currency, saying, "Money talks and bull walks." The third reason we celebrate is this is over for 6 months, and Matt McCarley is grateful because we don't have any more yard signs for at least a year.
There you go. Thank you, Chase. Edwin Peacock is going to introduce a new member of Charlotte Rotary, I think. Is he here? Edwin? There he is. Okay. On his way up. Great. Thank you. And after the introduction, we're going to get Phil Valpone, Phil Van Hoy, and Mark Norman up here together to run through a quick list of stuff.
Well,
All yours, Edwin.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President Hawley. I want to welcome Bryce Chambliss, our newest member to Charlotte Rotary. We met the fall of 2015. He got involved in one of my campaigns, and we quickly became good friends. And politics didn't separate us, Chase Saunders. There was no scandal. I'm still standing. He's still my friend, and I'm really happy to introduce him. Bryce is from Northeast Florida. He went to the University of Richmond and took his first job in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1987 with Securian Financial. From there, he went into Zurich Insurance and was in client development in his role in the United States and London. Before that, he joined and he finished his career with Allianz as head of global brokerage management in New York, following a role of VP at Zurich. He took a sabbatical, and this is where the interesting stuff starts and where you need to ask him questions as your newest member. But he has retired, if you will, in a semi-retirement phase, and he took an RV trip and went to 15 national parks, and he went to 12 different states. So he's well-traveled. But he inquired with me about service and about wanting to be involved in the community, and I could think of no better platform to get involved in this community than Rotary. And so I'm most excited to introduce you today, Bryce. He's married, he lives in South Park, and I look forward to you getting to know our newest member, Bryce Chambliss.
And Bryce, let me we need to pass the baton here.
Thank you.
Welcome to our merry band. Okay, so Phil Valpone, Phil Van Hoy, Mark Norman, if you guys could all come up here. Phil, you're first. Phil,
The better-looking younger
Phil
one.
Valpone, yeah.
Okay, so I want you to take out your pens and paper or your smartphones. Make note of these dates, these numbers, I'm sorry. 10-2, 10-2, 27 at 10, and 19. So we have 10-2, 27-10, 19. Feel free to play those in the Powerball, Mega Ball coming up. What's important about those is these are our next dates in the continuing strong support for Tree Charlotte and Rotary. This Saturday at 10 o'clock, if you're able to, the past RI president, John Germ, will be at the Mint Museum at 2 o'clock planting a tree, as every Rotary president has done since Paul Harris in Charlotte when they visited Charlotte. It's also, he'll stick around for the foundation dinner. For those of you that are interested, on November 27th at 10 o'clock, on November 22nd at 10 o'clock before our normal Rotary meeting, we're going to be planting 35 trees with Tree Charlotte as part of Giving Tuesday celebrations. Rotary will be on the camera. So if you can come and plant 35 trees that morning, see me to volunteer. But our main tree planting this year is Saturday, January 19th, at 8 o'clock from 8 to noon, and in the Steel Creek Athletic Association fields, where we'll be planting about 300 trees. So that's our bulk planting.
And Phil, we're going to get you back up between now and then to
Wait,
yet
but
again
I have a
remind
third
us.
page. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you much.
Phil, number 2.
Phil's the number 2. I learned the pecking order when Sandy said, Chase has 3 minutes, I have 1. So, I want to mention the Excellence in Leadership Award for you newbies. everybody else knows about it. The deadline is November 19th. The instructions about how to nominate somebody are in the Rotary Reporter this week and the next couple of weeks. The award will be conferred February 5th at Myers Park Club. It's a very nice event, and if you look at the people who have received this award over the last 29 years, you'll see it's a very esteemed group, and we're very honored to be able to honor these people who deserve it so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. And give any suggestions you have to Phil. Mark Norman.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am honored to be leading the 25th annual Rotarian Ringing of the Bell at the Square for the Salvation Army. Very pleased to follow in the footsteps of Herb Harris and Tom Robertson. We will be ringing from November 19th until December 7th. Sign-ups are out there. For those of you who are looking at your calendars, you can sign up before you leave. I'll bring it back again next week. And then November 20th until December 7th, we'll be selling raffle tickets to help raise money with a lot of great prizes. So I hope you'll participate. Thank you.
Give all three of them a big round of applause. Thank you, guys. So there are two committee meetings immediately following the launch. The Environmental Committee with M. Sirwich meeting in Studio 1, and the Foundation Committee meeting in Studio 2. I wanted to just take a minute to comment a little bit about our program last week. And something I wrote a little more extensively in the Rotary Reflections that went out to you yesterday. You know, in our programming, and the programming folks are doing a wonderful job, we want to bring you perspectives on matters that are important to you, your lives, your businesses, and our community. And, you know, into that, sometimes we'll creep an opinion or two. But we're not a forum for advocacy unless there's a position to hear a timely rebuttal. Last week, we drifted into the advocacy range without any real ability to rebut, and so I apologize to you for that. You know, I did want to, though, note that, you know, as Charlotte Rotarians, I mean, we embrace turbulent times, and we talk with each other about them. And we need to keep doing that, and we need to do more of it. You know, there's very few organizations like ours where we've assembled an eclectic group of big thinkers like you, and we need to be spending time talking with each other. Where else can you do it in the city of Charlotte? This is a unique place. So today we're going to bring you a speaker because of the fact that I guess until the wee hours tomorrow morning we're still in election season, and you know, hopefully our speaker today is going to be long on perspective and have an absence of advocacy, but buckle up because I don't know, and you know, we're going to have fun. So we'll be back to basic blocking and tackling next week. David Hare is coming, our district governor. He's our speaker. Proudly wear your Rotary pin next week. And David's going to talk a little bit about an appointment that he made of Elizabeth Teagarden. Elizabeth, are you here? Elizabeth here? No. Anyway, Elizabeth is going to chair both at the district level, and since she's not here, I'm appointing her as the chair of our club's committee on this. The Rotarian Action Group for Peace, and it's an international effort to get us and other clubs involved in advancing peace, preventing war, resolving conflicts. Actually, Luther Moore, Pat Schaefer, and I have signed up for it already. We would love to have some more folks join us. Be looking for additional information on that. Okay, so introducing the head table, Chris Kemper over to my far right. You've heard from Luther Moore. Mac McCarley, who was missing earlier but showed up on the head table. Thank you, Mac. And Kim Bratton to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, President Mike. So Election Day in a newsroom is just chaos. Everybody is so wrapped up in breaking news and getting it on first and right. All the anchor people are terrified that we're going to say something off the cuff that's misconstrued, or we're going to screw somebody's name up. And we always do. But anyway, in the midst of all of that madness, there is this breath of fresh, nonpartisan air that comes in. Dr. Michael Bitzer, who gives us live interviews and puts everything in perspective, which is absolutely wonderful. And all of the years that I was anchoring the news and worked with him, I enjoyed that so much. Just a little bit of background about him. He is the chair of politics at Catawba College in Salisbury. He has been published more times than I can tell you. He has been interviewed on every major national news show in the country. Not to mention being quoted in the Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times. He is a really in-demand guy. He is the guy today, and we are so, so lucky to have you here. My friend, Dr. Michael Bitzer.
Here we are. Thank you, Kim, for that very kind and warm introduction, and thank you all for the opportunity to be back. It's been a couple of years, but I have always enjoyed presentations at these kinds of groups. And what I hope to be able to do today is to, as Kim said, lend some perspective, because I have withdrawn from the prediction powers that may or may not have come with my particular role. My crystal ball got cracked in 2016. It hasn't been fixed, and I'm perfectly fine with that. But what I try to do is, as an educator, to help people understand patterns, trends. I am a data geek, so you will see some numbers. But what I hope to be able to do is put today into some kind of context to where you can understand this evening how we got here and potentially, and I will not predict, but potentially where we go from here. So we are talking about a blue moon and or blue wave in the 2018 midterm election. And there are four kind of key points that I want to leave with you in terms of how political scientists, political analysts look at this year's elections. So first and foremost, midterms are typically always referendums on the president and the party in power. That has become a stay in terms of how we study congressional elections. And I'll give some more details about each one of these. The second point, the hyper-polarized partisanship that we are currently experiencing drives voter choice. And I'll give you some data about that as well. North Carolina's Blue Moon election, the last time we had this kind of election with no U.S. Senate, we don't elect governors in midterm years, was 2006. Different dynamic from then. And I'll talk a little bit about the congressional races where some of the ideas and concepts that we're studying about, and then a little bit about the General Assembly as well. And then finally, how big could this Democratic wave be, if any? And I think oftentimes, for even today at this particular hour, I'm still questioning, trying to figure out the answer to that question. So if you feel confused, if you feel overwhelmed, trust me, the polls close in about 7 hours. It will be done, then we will start 2020. But I will wait on that particular note. The first and most important point for most of us who study elections, the referendum idea. The referendum on the president and the party. And I want to go back to 1934, FDR's first midterm. You may not be able to see the numbers, but look at the bars. The bars indicate, the dark red bars indicate House seats gained or lost, and then Senate seats gained or lost. And you will see that basically in 2 elections, the president's party gained seats in both chambers. There was one year where the gain was in the House and it was even in the Senate. But for the most part, history tells us that the pattern is the president's party will lose seats in either or both chambers. And that's an important data trend that we look at as political scientists to try and start to put things into context. This gives you the House seats that were lost since Reagan's first midterm. And what I want to do is overlay it with presidential approval ratings. And so this line gives you the various levels of the president's approval at the time of the midterm. Ronald Reagan in his first midterm was sitting at 42%. In his second midterm, it went up into the mid-60s. But you see it bouncing around most recently in the George W. Bush second midterm and then Barack Obama in the low 40s to mid-40s. Compare that to how the House seats either won or lost. For the most part, House seats were lost by modern presidents. Only in 1998, when Bill Clinton was under impeachment, and then right after 9/11, 2001, the 2002 midterms, seats were picked up by George W. Bush and the Republicans. But for the most part, presidents lose seats in the House. Here's the same graph with the approval ratings and the Senate seats, won or lost. Again, for the most part, presidents lose seats in congressional midterms. Now, what we're seeing this year is a distinctive map, and in fact, we are seeing two basically different elections going on, one for the House and one for the Senate. So if we're basing all of this on presidential approval numbers, here's President Trump since his inauguration in terms of presidential approval or disapproval. And he's actually sitting where Barack Obama was in his two midterms in the mid-40s, if you take the average of most of the polls. So the basic trend, sitting in mid-40s, the likelihood is seats will be lost by the president's party. But the Senate is different from the House this year. And for Democrats, they are defending many more seats, 26, to only 9 Republican seats. And so you can go about classifying these Senate seats into distinct categories. For Democrats, it's all likelihood. California, Washington, New York, Virginia, those are safe Democratic seats. You get into the likely Democratic seats, you kind of complete the Rust Belt section, Pennsylvania, Michigan, into Wisconsin. The two seats that are likely Democratic seats, Montana and Ohio, and then you get into the toss-ups, the competitive ones. And for Democrats, it's basically 5 states, 4 of which went strongly for Donald Trump 2 years ago. It looks like North Dakota with Heidi Heitkamp is going to flip, but the battle is going to be in Missouri, Indiana, West Virginia, and most importantly, in Florida again. Then you go to the Republican side. Republican toss-up seats, Nevada, Arizona, and Tennessee. Tennessee likely to stay Republican, but the wave could bring Phil Bredesen into office if it's big enough. That's a high hurdle to meet, but there could be a potential there. Everybody's focused on Texas, and in particularly the power of Beto O'Rourke to raise well over $75 million for one Senate seat. That seat will become the most expensive one when all is said and done. Texas, for a lot of analysts, we have been predicting Texas is going to change, it's going to evolve, it's going to switch, it's going to become competitive. And every election year, Texas votes Republican. It will happen, we're just not sure when. But this year, the dynamic is something Texans have never seen in terms of a U.S. Senate race. Then you've got the likely Republican safe seats. Mississippi actually has 2 Senate contests going on. One of them could go to a runoff in December, so that might be something to watch later this evening. On the House side, it's all about the generic congressional ballot. If you were going to vote today, would you vote for a Democrat or for a Republican for Congress? And over time, what we have seen is a consistent yet varying lead for Democrats on the congressional ballot. Right now, they're averaging a +7. That would be a pretty significant wave if that wave were to come through and hold on those lines. Charlie Cook is probably one of the most respected independent political analysts. His forecast today, about 50 more Democratic solid seats than Republican. But when you get into the likely and lean, and the pure toss-up, all Democrats need are 24 seats to flip majority control. And that is already evident in the toss-up areas, several of which are in this state, and I can talk about that a little bit later. So referendums on the president, but we have, as we continue into this hyper-polarized world that we exist in, voter choice based on partisanship. And what I want to do is present some data from the American National Election Study in 2016, the last presidential election. And they asked the question, do you identify as a Democrat, Republican, or an independent? And then they asked the strength of your partisanship. Are you a strong partisan? If you're an independent, do you lean to one party over the other? Taking that data, I then looked at the responses for, well, how did all of these categories, strong Democrat, not strong Democrat, all the way over to strong Republican, how did they actually vote for their party's president? If you look at the strong partisans, strong Democrats and strong Republicans, 95+% for their party. Not surprising, because these are the diehards, the loyalists, the foam at your mouth, kind of rabid partisans that we have. Move into the less foaming at the mouth partisans, the not strong Democrats, not strong Republicans. 3/4 of them voted for their party's presidential candidate. Now, we all talk about the great independents, the mass of moderates that's going to save the country from itself. Well, if you ask independents, do you lean to one party over the other, most of them split fairly evenly down the middle. And in fact, when you ask them, an independent Democrat or an independent-leaning Republican, did you vote for your party's presidential candidate? They actually vote more for the party's candidate than the weak partisans. It's only when you get into the pure independents, less than 10% of the electorate, where they split their votes. So partisanship reigns. Another key signal that I look at. In the same survey, they ask, is there something that you like about your party, and is there anything that you like about the opposition? Strong partisans, strong Democrats, yeah, 85% of them said, there's something I like about my party. Less than 20% say the same thing about the opposition. On the Republican side, a mirror image. Now, when you start to move into the middle, the not strong partisans on Democratic and Republican move into the independent Democrats, the independent Republicans, almost mirror images of how each side sees itself and sees the opposition. So what about the independents? The folks that save us in the middle, do they like anything about either party? Nope. Less than 1/4 have anything nice to say about either party. So that's at the kind of the macro level. One of my research agendas is that I'm doing some work at the precinct level, trying to get down into the weeds of voting behavior. And I read a book several years ago, and I've assigned it to a class by Bill Bishop called The Big Sort. And he makes the argument that basically we have sorted ourselves into like-minded communities, we interact with like-minded individuals, we live in our isolated bubbles, and then when we meet somebody from the opposite bubble, we go, hey, he ain't from Mars, he's from Pluto, if it's still a planet, okay? So this idea of how we have sorted ourselves got me to thinking, could we see this play out at the precinct level? And so what I did was I applied it to the precincts by saying, if in a year's election, the statewide average for a party was, say, 49%, but a precinct voted for that particular political candidate at 59, well, that's a plus 10. Then in the next election, maybe it was even more of a spread. Precinct went 20. So I took the two elections, averaged them, and then classified them into, if it's plus 10 or greater, likely for one party. If it's kind of 3 to 10, well, it leans to that party. Less than 3, it's a toss-up precinct, kind of a competitive precinct. And then I color-coded. Dark red for strong Republican, dark blue for strong Democrat, green for competitive. And I did this for Rowan County, my home county. Here's Rowan County, and tell me if you can tell me where Salisbury and Spencer is. Look how few precincts, though, are competitive, are toss-up. Now, I can't come to Mecklenburg County and not show you Mecklenburg. So I go back to 2004, 2008, George W. Bush, Barack Obama's elections. Here's Mecklenburg County. The yellow lines are the city council districts for the city of Charlotte. Notice the north, well, except for that blue splotch. Everybody knows what that blue splotch is, right? Davidson, those faculty. Oh. But you got the strong Republican North, you've got the strong Republican South, you've got this classic Republican wedge south part of the city of Charlotte, but deep blues, deep reds, few greens. Here's 2008, 2012, the Obama election years. Notice what changes. You start to see some modifications going on in the South, in the North. Things aren't as red in the North and in the South part of the county. 2012 and 2016. Compare 2004 and 8 to 2012 and 16 and focus on South Charlotte. The transformation going on there. That's something to watch going into the future. Polarized partisanship driving our vote choices, that's going to be evident this year in this blue moon election cycle. We've got 10 Republican congressional districts, 3 Democratic districts, but basically the nation is watching 3 of our districts, the 9th, the 13th, and the 2nd. And instead of showing you basic numbers out of those, I decided to look at one key statistic. How a district voted for President Trump in comparison to how it voted for the Republican congressional candidate. Now, for example, in the 9th, Donald Trump got 55% of the vote in the 9th congressional district in 2016. Robert Pittenger got 58%. So it was a fairly close connection. If you take all 13 districts, and for the stats geeks out there, it's a pretty close fit. In fact, you can explain 97% of a Republican congressional candidate's vote based on how that district voted for Donald Trump. The connection is there, and that's the thing I'm going to be watching tonight. If you take the state Senate, 35 Republican seats, Democrats hope to break the majority, supermajority status. If you do the exact same thing, line up the president's vote with the Senate Republican candidate's vote, 95% explanation. Now in the State House, 120 seats, 75 Republican, it's what we in statistics call a little noisier. There's a little more dispersion along the line, but still you're explaining 82% of the vote for a State House Republican candidate by how that district voted for Donald Trump. So in my mind, if the Democratic wave goes against the president's numbers, we should see a corresponding effect as well on these districts. Last, how big is this wave, if there is one? It feels like one. The generic ballot has one at 7. CNN had a poll to where it was 13 points, generic ballot. I think that's an outlier. But it looks like there is momentum over the weekend breaking, and typically what tends to happen is the break favors one party over the other. So if you look at comparing early turnout, 2 million early votes have been cast this year. And so for a comparison, here's 2010's numbers. Here's 2014, 10 days of early voting. And here's presidential year 2016. Now we thought it's a midterm year. It'll act like a midterm year with early votes. Yeah, not so much. We're actually closer to 2016 numbers of early votes than we are to 2014. That means turnout could break a record. And in fact, if you look at North Carolina voter turnout, you can pretty much ride it along in terms of looking at when presidential years are and when midterm years are. Because it's a nice up and down, up and down, up and down. Well, you get to 1990 with the Helms Harvey Gantt Senate race. That was a presidential level year. But in recent years, the last blue moon election cycle, 2006, 36% voter turnout. Folks, we already have about 30% of the 7 million registered voters in North Carolina having voted already through early voting. If you look at partisan turnout within these years, the key thing with the smaller bar charts are the midterms. Republicans, registered Republicans, typically always overperform and are the highest in terms of turnout in midterm years. Based on the numbers from early voting already, a third of registered Democrats have already cast ballots. 30% of Republicans, about a quarter of unaffiliated voters. Unaffiliateds will probably determine this year's election in that regard. 8 seconds. Boy, that was pretty good. So the 4 key points I would leave you with: a referendum in a hyper-polarized environment, a weird election, and it is a strange election year. This is unlike any midterm that I've seen in this state. And then tell me what the number is for the Democratic wave. If we have a few minutes, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Let's give Michael a round of applause. Thank you, Michael. Any questions, observations? Yes, please. Yeah.
I have a question about the sample size and how it comes into play. When I look back at some of the research that you guys have done in 2016, I would see that maybe 890 to 1,000 people were included in the sample sizes. Can you reflect on how, is that a good size from a statistical standpoint, or is that just the accepted norm that you guys use in developing that sample?
I will say up front that I'm not a polling expert. I would defer to my colleague Scott Huffman at Winthrop University, who runs the Winthrop poll as the leading expert in the Carolinas about public polling. What I would say is, yes, 800 to 1,000, if you can get people to answer the phone and not block you, is a representative statistical sample. What you generally tend to see are surveys around 500 to 600. And that's because oftentimes to get about 500 responses, you have to make 20,000 phone calls to get 500 people to answer. Now, there is also weighting that goes on. Maybe white men are overrepresented, maybe black females are underrepresented. There will be weighting done, but that weighting tries to predict what the electorate will look like. If you ask me right here and now, what is the electorate going to look like this evening? I have no idea, because it's all a guess. But in terms of the sample size and the approach that most reputable pollsters take, it is indeed statistically valid.
Great. Yes, Mary.
The question was about the rise of far-right parties in Europe, and could that potentially happen here in the United States, both far left and far right? First off, I would say I'm not a Europeanist. There are 2 types of political scientists. There are those that study the United States, and then there are those that study everybody else. I'm an Americanist. I've got enough crazy people to work with in terms of dealing with that. With that said, I think the rise of particularly the far-right authoritarian approach is something that is becoming more and more prevalent in European countries. And as it relates to the United States, back in the 1950s, a group of political scientists wrote a report that said there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and that the two parties should be different. They should stand for different things and give a choice to the voters. Well, guess what, folks? We got that. It's almost too much of a choice between the two. This intensity of polarization, I wish I could say that it's going to change. The numbers that I see already with the new millennial generation and Gen Zs coming along, they are just as polarized as the other generations, except they are a center-left generation as opposed to baby boomers being a center-right. And so I think the country's dynamic is simply going to shift, but we are going to continue this level of polarization. The question was about election tampering and whether there should be concerns. Voter fraud is a minuscule documented issue. The concern that I have is about election administration. And that is, you will hear today that the North Carolina State Board of Elections is holding an emergency hearing today because paper ballots have been affected by humidity and are not being read properly. That's an administration issue. And that's the concern that I have in terms of what we should be aware of and concerned about when it comes to that kind of an issue. The question was about what are the issues that separate the two parties, because they have ideologically and changed all around. And it's hard for my students to understand that at one point there used to be this thing called a Southern Conservative Democrat, just as much as there used to be this thing called a Rockefeller Republican. So getting them to understand that dynamic. The way that I explain it easiest is take two issues, social issues and economic issues. Do you want the government involved, or do you want the government to stay out of it? On social issues and on economic issues. And the way that I present it is, for conservatives, they want the government involved in social issues, but to stay out of economic issues. For liberals, it's the exact opposite. Stay out of social issues, but get involved in economic issues. And so I think that helps students try and wrap their head around what does it mean to be a Democrat in today's environment? What does it mean to be a Republican in today's environment? But they have to understand the history of where those two political parties and the foundational ideas of, do we like power centralized or do we like power localized? And that's a core issue going through the parties as well.
Race real quick and then Jerry. And Jerry's daughter. Actually, we're going to get Jerry's daughter to ask the question.
Okay. On racial issues, the issue of civil rights is probably the foundational, fundamental shift. And I'm teaching Southern politics this year, and I went through the entire timeline of how both parties have basically evolved and shifted on civil rights. And one of my better students, after hearing about 2 weeks of me lecturing and discussing and them reading, came up with a very simple question. So was Barry Goldwater the most influential loser of the 20th century? I said, yeah, pretty much. Yes, ma'am. Okay. The key thing to know about a poll is that it's a snapshot in time. It's when we get that person to answer the phone and answer the questions. At that moment, that's what we know. Polls can fluctuate all over the place. What I recommend to my students is go to something like Real Clear Politics. They take all of the polls, do a simple average, and you can see where the trend lines are. If one is an outlier, it will be very obvious. But I think For stability's sake, what we have gotten into is basically taking the aggregate and the averages to then say, this looks like where the trend line is moving, but trends can do this, they can do that, or they could do this. And that's, to me, that's part of the beauty of being a political scientist. You don't know where this is going. How did abortion become the polarizing issue between the two political parties? Roe v. Wade, and the rise of social evangelical conservatives who before 1980, actually in 1976, a majority of them supported Jimmy Carter, and then the transition to the Reagan coalition brought them in full square. And I think, again, it signals the idea of how do the parties look at government involvement on a social issue? Race, abortion, marriage rights, all of these things, you know, kind of get sorted into one camp over the other based on the idea of, do you want government involved in it or do you want government to stay out of it? And that's kind of how I make sense of how things play out.
Thank you, Michael. We
My
appreciate it
pleasure.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've survived yet another election cycle, and I thank you. Thank you, Michael, for your wisdom today. There is a meeting of the Environmental Committee in Studio 1, the Foundation in Studio 2, and David Hare will be here next week, so please be wearing your Rotary pin, and we'll see you then. We're adjourned.